It's the year 447, and the most powerful empire in the known world is holding its breath. In the grand marble halls of Constantinople, Emperor Theodosius II sits on his golden throne. But today, gold feels as fragile as parchment. A messenger bursts through the palace doors, his face drained of color, his hands trembling as he carries a single piece of weathered parchment. The court falls silent. Even the whispered conversations of advisors die away. The messenger's voice cracks as he delivers just 2 words that would haunt the empire for years to come. Attila comes. Imagine being so feared that your very name could empty a room of the world's most powerful men. Imagine striking such terror into hearts that emperors would rather pay mountains of gold than face you in battle. This wasn't just any warrior or tribal chief we're talking about. This was Attila the Hun, a man whose reputation traveled faster than his armies, whose shadow stretched across continents. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. Attila wasn't born into power. He wasn't handed an empire on a silver platter. He was a nomadic chieftain from the steppes, a man who understood that true strength doesn't always come from the sword, but from knowing exactly when to use it and when to hold it back. How does someone go from being a wandering horseman to commanding the largest empire Europe had ever seen? How do you build a kingdom that stretches from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea all the way down to the warm waters of the Black Sea? And perhaps most intriguingly, how do you become so legendary that 1,500 years later, people still whisper your name with a mixture of awe and dread? This is the story of a man who didn't just conquer lands, he conquered minds. Attila understood something that many great generals missed. Sometimes the threat of violence is more powerful than violence itself. He turned extortion into an art form, making Rome pay him tribute year after year, not because they couldn't fight him, but because they were terrified of what would happen if they tried. Think about it. Here's a man who made the mighty Roman Empire, the superpower of the ancient world, pay him protection money like some kind of medieval mob boss. But unlike a common criminal, Attila had vision. He saw weakness where others saw strength, opportunity where others saw chaos. The Romans called him the Scourge of God, believing he was sent by the heavens to punish them for their sins. But was he really a divine instrument of punishment? Or was he simply a brilliant strategist who knew how to exploit the cracks in an empire that had grown too comfortable with its own power? What's truly remarkable is how Attila managed to unite tribes that had been fighting each other for generations. Huns, Goths, Germanic peoples, Iranian tribes, groups that spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and had completely different ways of life. Yet somehow this one man managed to bring them all under his banner. That's not just military genius, that's political mastery of the highest order. But here's the thing that makes Attila's story so compelling. He was walking a tightrope between 2 worlds. On one side, you had the sophisticated, wealthy Roman Empire with its marble cities, complex politics, and centuries of military tradition. On the other side, you had the fierce, nomadic tribes of the steppes, with their horse-riding culture and warrior codes. Attila had to navigate between these 2 completely different worlds, and somehow he managed to dominate both. And let's not forget the human drama at the heart of this story. This wasn't just about armies clashing on battlefields. This was about a man who had to make impossible choices, who had to balance the loyalty of his own people with the demands of ruling an empire. This was about someone who understood that power is as much about psychology as it is about swords and shields. So as we dive into this incredible tale of ambition, strategy, and the rise of one of history's most feared leaders, ask yourself, what would you do if you were faced with the same choices Attila faced? Would you have the courage to challenge the most powerful empire in the world? Would you have the wisdom to know when to fight and when to negotiate? And most importantly, would you be able to handle the weight of being both feared and respected by millions? This is the story of Attila the Hun, the man who made emperors tremble and changed the course of history forever. Get ready for a journey into a world where one man's vision reshaped the destiny of nations. Before we unravel this medieval saga, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, and hit the bell so you never miss a tale from the heart of history. Picture the world around the year 400 after Christ. Rome, the eternal city that had ruled for centuries, was no longer the unstoppable force it once was. The empire that had conquered most of the known world was now struggling to hold itself together. It was like watching a mighty oak tree that had stood for generations suddenly showing cracks in its trunk. Into this world of uncertainty and change, a boy was born somewhere in the vast grasslands of Pannonia, in what we now call Hungary. His name was Attila, and he entered a world where everything seemed to be falling apart and rebuilding itself at the same time. But here's what makes this story so fascinating. Attila wasn't born into chaos by accident. The Huns, his people, were actually part of the reason Rome was struggling. These weren't your typical settled farmers or city dwellers. The Huns were nomads, master horsemen who had swept in from the distant steppes of Asia, bringing with them a completely different way of life. Imagine growing up in a world where your home wasn't a house with walls and a roof, but wherever your horse could take you. The Huns lived in felt tents, moved with the seasons, and could pack up their entire civilization and be gone within hours. They were incredibly skilled with their short, powerful bows, and they could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy even while riding at full gallop. Young Attila would have learned to ride before he could properly walk. He would have grown up hearing the thunder of hooves, the creaking of leather saddles, and the whoosh of arrows finding their targets. But more importantly, he would have absorbed the Hun way of thinking about the world, that strength came from mobility, that survival depended on adaptability, and that the weak deserved to be conquered by the strong. Now, you might think that a boy growing up in this nomadic warrior culture would spend his entire childhood on the steppes, but here's where Attila's story takes a fascinating turn. When he was still just a young boy, probably around 10 or 12 years old, something happened that would change the course of his life forever. His uncle Rugila, who was the king of the Huns at the time, made a deal with the Roman Empire. It was a common practice back then called diplomatic hostage exchange. Essentially, important families would send their children to live with their enemies as a way of ensuring peace. It was like saying, "Look, we're serious about this treaty because we're trusting you with our most precious possessions, our children." So young Attila found himself torn away from the wide-open steppes, from the familiar sounds of his people, from everything he had ever known, and shipped off to Rome. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? One day, you're a free-spirited nomad boy learning to hunt and ride, and the next day you're walking through the marble streets of the most powerful city in the world. But here's the thing that makes Attila's story so compelling. This wasn't just a traumatic experience for him. It was the most valuable education he could have possibly received. While other Hun children were learning to shoot arrows and tend horses, Attila was getting a masterclass in Roman politics, military strategy, and most importantly, Roman weaknesses. Picture this young barbarian boy, probably still rough around the edges, suddenly thrust into the sophisticated world of Roman high society. He would have lived in grand villas with marble columns and intricate mosaics. He would have eaten foods he'd never imagined, worn clothes made from silk and fine wool, and witnessed the complex ceremonies and rituals that kept Roman society functioning. But Attila wasn't just passively observing, he was learning. He was watching how Roman senators made deals in dark corners, how military commanders could be bought with gold, how the common people grew more and more dissatisfied with their leaders. He was seeing firsthand that this great empire everyone feared was actually held together by corruption, political maneuvering, and the constant threat of internal rebellion. Think about what that must have done to a young mind. Here was a boy who had grown up believing that strength came from the sword and the bow, suddenly discovering that Romans often preferred to buy their way out of problems rather than fight. He was learning that the empire that seemed so mighty from the outside was actually rotten at its core. And there's something else that makes this period of Attila's life so important. He was learning the Roman language, their customs, their military tactics. He was essentially being trained by his future enemies. It was like a future chess grandmaster being taught the game by the very people he would one day defeat. The Romans probably thought they were civilizing this barbarian boy, teaching him to appreciate Roman culture and values. They might have hoped that when he returned to his people, he would be more sympathetic to Rome, more willing to maintain peaceful relations. But what they were actually doing was creating their own worst nightmare. Years passed, and eventually, the young hostage was allowed to return to his people. But the boy who came back to the steppes was not the same child who had left. He had learned to speak like a Roman, to think like a Roman, to understand Roman psychology. But he had never forgotten that he was a Hun. When Attila finally returned to his people, he carried with him something more dangerous than any weapon: knowledge. He understood that Rome's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. The empire was incredibly wealthy, but that wealth had made it soft. Roman leaders would rather pay tribute than fight battles. Roman soldiers were more interested in their comfortable lives than in dying for glory. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned that fear could be more powerful than force. He had seen how Roman politicians would panic at the first sign of trouble, how they would throw gold at problems rather than face them directly. He had discovered that Rome could indeed be bled dry, just as his uncle and the other Hun leaders had suspected. So when young Attila returned to the steppes, he wasn't just bringing back stories of marble palaces and golden coins. He was bringing back a blueprint for how to defeat the most powerful empire in the world. He had learned that you didn't need to conquer Rome with massive armies and long sieges. You could terrorize it into submission, extort it into poverty, and ultimately destroy it from within. This is what made Attila so dangerous. He wasn't just another barbarian leader with a talent for war. He was a barbarian leader who understood his enemies better than they understood themselves. He had been educated by Rome, but he had never been conquered by Rome. And that combination of knowledge and independence would soon make him the most feared man in the known world. When old King Rugala died around the year 434, the Hun Empire faced a moment that would define its future. According to Hun tradition, power didn't automatically pass to the eldest son like it did in many other cultures. Instead, leadership often went to the most capable members of the royal family, and sometimes that meant sharing the throne. And so it was that two brothers found themselves ruling the most powerful nomadic empire the world had ever seen. Attila and Bleda, nephews of the deceased king, became joint rulers of the Huns. On the surface, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable arrangement. After all, the empire was vast, stretching across thousands of miles, and surely two heads were better than one when it came to managing such a massive territory. But here's the thing about shared power. It rarely stays shared for long. It's like trying to steer a horse with two riders pulling the reins in different directions. Eventually, someone has to take control, or the whole thing falls apart. At first glance, the brothers seemed to complement each other well. Bleda was the older of the two, and he had a reputation for being straightforward and honest in his dealings. He was well liked by the Hun nobles, and had a natural charisma that made people want to follow him. In many ways, he was exactly what you'd expect from a traditional Hun king: brave, decisive, and respected by his warriors. Attila, on the other hand, was different. He was quieter, more calculating. While Bleda was the kind of leader who would charge into battle at the front of his army, Attila was the one who would spend hours studying maps, planning strategies, and thinking 3 moves ahead of his enemies. He had that Roman education working in his favor, giving him a perspective that most Hun leaders simply didn't possess. For several years, this arrangement seemed to work. The brothers divided their responsibilities, with Bleda handling much of the day-to-day administration and military leadership, while Attila focused on diplomatic relations, particularly with the Roman Empire. This division of labor made sense given Attila's unique understanding of Roman politics and psychology. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. You see, while Bleda was content to maintain the status quo, Attila had much bigger ambitions. He had seen the weakness of Rome firsthand during his time as a hostage, and he understood that the Huns were in a position to exploit that weakness in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The first real crack in their relationship appeared when they began negotiating with the Eastern Roman Empire. The Romans, desperate to maintain peace with the Huns, were willing to pay substantial tribute, essentially protection money, to avoid being attacked. But the brothers had very different ideas about how to handle these negotiations. Bleda, being more traditional in his approach, was satisfied with the tribute payments they were already receiving. To him, it was free money for doing nothing, and it allowed the Huns to focus on other conquests and raids. Why rock the boat when things were going so well? Attila, however, saw this as just the beginning. He realized that if the Romans were willing to pay them once, they could be squeezed for much more. He understood that fear was a currency more valuable than gold, and he wanted to use that fear to extract every possible advantage from the empire. As time went on, it became increasingly clear that the brothers were fundamentally different types of leaders. Bleda was a warrior king in the traditional mold, someone who was content to rule through strength and personal loyalty. Attila, on the other hand, was something entirely new, a strategic thinker who understood that true power came not just from winning battles, but from controlling the very idea of what those battles might cost. The breaking point came when they had to decide how to respond to Roman attempts to play diplomatic games. The Romans, being Romans, tried to be clever. They would send separate embassies to each brother, hoping to create divisions between them or to play one against the other. It was the kind of political maneuvering that Romans had perfected over centuries of dealing with barbarian tribes. But here's where Attila's Roman education proved invaluable. He could see exactly what the Romans were trying to do, and he knew how to turn their own tactics against them. He wanted to present a united front that would force the Romans to deal with the Huns on Hun terms, not Roman terms. Bleda, however, was less patient with these political games. He preferred direct action to diplomatic maneuvering, and he was growing frustrated with what he saw as unnecessary complications. Why not just take what they wanted by force rather than engaging in these elaborate negotiations? This fundamental disagreement about strategy created a rift that grew wider with each passing month. The Hun nobles began to notice that the brothers were no longer presenting a united front. In council meetings, they would subtly contradict each other. In negotiations with enemies, they would send mixed signals. In military campaigns, they would sometimes pursue different objectives. And then, in the year 445, something happened that changed everything. Bleda died suddenly and unexpectedly. The official cause was given as natural causes, but the timing was remarkably convenient for Attila. Just when the power struggle between the brothers was reaching its peak, just when it seemed like the Hun Empire might fracture under the weight of their disagreements, Bleda was gone. Now, we need to be careful here. The historical record from this period is incomplete, and much of what we know comes from sources that were written years or even decades after the events. But the fact remains that Bleda's death was so convenient for Attila that it raised suspicions even among his own people. Some of the Hun nobles whispered that Attila had arranged his brother's death. Others suggested that Bleda had been poisoned, though they were careful to speak such accusations only in the darkest corners of their tents. Still others claimed that it was simply the will of the gods, that fate had decided which brother was meant to rule alone. But here's what we do know for certain. Attila wasted no time in consolidating his power. Within weeks of Bleda's death, he had secured the loyalty of all the major Hun chiefs and nobles. He eliminated potential rivals, rewarded his supporters, and made it clear that the age of shared leadership was over. Whether Bleda died of natural causes or met a more sinister end, the result was the same. Attila now stood alone at the head of the most powerful barbarian empire the world had ever known. And unlike his brother, he had no intention of being satisfied with the current arrangement with Rome. The period of joint rule was over, and with it, any chance that the Huns might remain a manageable threat to the Roman Empire. Attila had learned patience during those years of sharing power with his brother, but now that patience was about to be replaced by something far more dangerous, ambition unleashed. The shadow of the twin kings had passed, and in its place stood a single ruler who would soon make the world tremble. Attila was no longer just a king of the Huns. He was about to become the Scourge of God. Now that Attila stood alone as the undisputed ruler of the Huns, he was ready to put his years of observation and planning into action. But here's what made him different from every other barbarian leader who had ever threatened Rome. Attila understood that the most effective way to defeat an empire wasn't necessarily to destroy it, but to make it destroy itself. Think about it this way. Most conquerors throughout history followed a pretty straightforward playbook. Raise an army, march on your enemies, fight battles, capture territory, and rule over what you've conquered. It's expensive, it's risky, and it requires you to actually govern the lands you've taken. But Attila had learned something during his time in Rome that most barbarian leaders never grasped. Sometimes the threat of violence is more profitable than violence itself. So instead of immediately launching massive invasions, Attila developed what we might call today a protection racket on an imperial scale. He would send ambassadors to the Eastern Roman Empire with a simple message: "Pay us tribute, and we won't attack your cities." It was brilliant in its simplicity, and it worked better than anyone could have imagined. The Eastern Romans, who ruled from the magnificent city of Constantinople, found themselves in an impossible position. They could see what the Huns were capable of. They had heard the stories of cities burned to the ground, of armies scattered like leaves in a windstorm. They knew that Attila commanded not just Huns, but a vast confederation of Germanic tribes, Gothic warriors, and other peoples who had been swept up in his growing empire. So they paid. Year after year, they sent wagon loads of gold to the Hun camps. We're talking about thousands of pounds of pure gold, enough wealth to fund entire armies for years. To put this in perspective, the annual tribute that Constantinople paid to Attila was sometimes more than the entire budget of some Roman provinces. But here's where Attila's genius really showed. He didn't just take the money and disappear. He understood that fear was like a garden that needed constant tending. If you let people get too comfortable, they might start thinking they don't need to pay you anymore. So he would periodically remind the Romans exactly why they were paying him in the first place. The pattern was always the same, and it was devastatingly effective. Attila would make increasingly demanding requests for tribute. The Romans would try to negotiate, to find ways to pay less or to delay the payments. And then, just when they thought they might be able to get away with it, Attila would unleash his armies on some unfortunate city or province. The psychological impact of this strategy was enormous. Roman administrators throughout the Eastern Empire lived in constant fear that their city might be next. They never knew when a dust cloud on the horizon might turn out to be Hun cavalry riding toward their walls. This uncertainty was perhaps even more damaging than actual attacks would have been, because it paralyzed the entire imperial bureaucracy, and Attila made sure his reputation preceded him wherever he went. When his armies did attack, they didn't just defeat their enemies, they made examples of them. Cities that resisted were burned to the ground. Populations that fought back were scattered to the winds. The message was always the same: this is what happens when you don't pay what we ask. But it wasn't just about intimidation. Attila also understood the Roman political system well enough to exploit its weaknesses. He knew that Roman officials were often more concerned with their own careers than with the good of the empire. So he would sometimes target specific regions or cities whose governors had been particularly difficult to deal with, sending a clear message to other officials about the consequences of defying him. The Romans, for their part, found themselves trapped in a cycle they couldn't break. Every time they paid tribute, it only encouraged Attila to demand more. But every time they tried to resist, he would demonstrate that the cost of resistance was far higher than the cost of compliance. It was like being caught in quicksand. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. This strategy reached its peak in the year 447, when the Eastern Romans made a critical mistake. They had been paying tribute for years, and some officials in Constantinople began to believe that maybe Attila was getting soft, that maybe he was becoming too dependent on their payments to actually risk a war. They decided to test his resolve by delaying their tribute payments and sending ambassadors to negotiate for better terms. Attila's response was swift and devastating. He unleashed his armies on the Eastern Roman territories with a fury that hadn't been seen in generations. This wasn't just a raid or a limited campaign. This was total war, designed to remind everyone why they had been paying him in the first place. The Hun armies swept through the Balkans like a hurricane, destroying everything in their path. They captured city after city, each victory making the next one easier as defenders fled rather than face the approaching storm. The Roman military, which had grown comfortable with decades of relative peace, was completely unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the Hun assault. The climax came at a place called the Utus River, in what is now Bulgaria. The Eastern Roman Empire had managed to gather together what they believed was a formidable army, complete with experienced generals and well-equipped soldiers. They were determined to make a stand, to show Attila that Rome was not defenseless. But when the two armies met, the result was a disaster for the Romans. The Hun cavalry, with their superior mobility and devastating archery, tore through the Roman formations like a knife through silk. The Roman army, which had seemed so impressive on paper, collapsed in a matter of hours. Thousands of Roman soldiers were killed or captured, and the survivors fled in panic toward Constantinople. The psychological impact of this victory was even greater than the military one. Here was proof that Attila wasn't just a skilled extortionist. He was also a military genius who could destroy Roman armies when he chose to do so. The message was impossible to ignore. The tribute payments weren't just buying peace, they were buying survival. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Utus, the Eastern Romans found themselves in a position they had never experienced before. They were forced to send ambassadors to Attila, not as equals negotiating a treaty, but as defeated enemies begging for mercy. The proud empire that had once ruled the Mediterranean world was now groveling before a barbarian chieftain. And Attila, showing the same strategic brilliance that had brought him this far, didn't press his advantage too hard. He could have marched on Constantinople itself, and there's a good chance he could have taken it. But he understood that a destroyed city pays no tribute, and that his real goal wasn't conquest, but control. Instead, he negotiated new terms that were far more favorable to him than anything the Romans had ever agreed to before. The tribute payments were tripled, vast territories were ceded to Hun control, and the Romans were forced to agree to a series of humiliating diplomatic protocols that made it clear who was really in charge. The terror of Constantinople was complete. The Eastern Roman Empire, one of the most powerful states in the world, had been reduced to a tributary of a barbarian confederation. And the man who had achieved this wasn't some wild berserker who had gotten lucky in battle. He was a calculating strategist who had turned extortion into an art form. But perhaps most importantly, Attila had proven that his years of patient observation and planning had paid off. He had found a way to defeat Rome without destroying it, to profit from the empire's wealth without taking on the burden of governing it. It was a strategy that would define the rest of his career, and it would strike fear into the hearts of Romans for generations to come. The question now was, if the Eastern Romans had been brought to their knees so easily, what would happen when Attila turned his attention to the West? What would you have done if Attila demanded your surrender? Let us know in the comments. And if you're gripped by this story, smash that like button, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe for more epic tales. Just when you think you've heard every possible twist in the story of Attila the Hun, history throws you a curveball that's so unexpected, so dramatic, that it sounds like something out of a romance novel. But this is real history, and sometimes real history is stranger than any fiction writer could imagine. Picture this. It's the year 450, and Attila has already established himself as the most feared man in Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire is paying him tribute. His armies are growing stronger every year, and everyone knows it's only a matter of time before he turns his attention to the Western Roman Empire. But then, out of nowhere, he receives a message that changes everything. The message comes from Ravenna, the capital of the Western Roman Empire, and it's not from the emperor or any of his generals. It's from a woman named Honoria. And she's not just any woman, she's the sister of Emperor Valentinian III himself. And what she's proposing is so audacious, so completely unprecedented, that it takes even Attila by surprise. Honoria is offering to marry him. Not only that, but she's claiming that as his wife, she would bring him half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. Think about that for a moment. Here's a Roman princess, a member of the imperial family, secretly writing to the most dangerous enemy of Rome and essentially offering to hand over half the empire to him. But to understand why this happened, we need to understand who Honoria was and what had driven her to such a desperate act. She wasn't just some love-struck princess who had fallen for the romance of the dangerous barbarian king. Honoria was a woman trapped in a political system that gave her no real power despite her royal birth. You see, in the 5th century, even imperial women had very limited options. They were expected to marry whoever would best serve the political interests of the empire, to produce heirs, and to stay quietly in the background while the men made all the important decisions. For someone like Honoria, who was intelligent, ambitious, and clearly had her own ideas about how things should be run, this was incredibly frustrating. The situation had become even worse for her recently. She had been caught in a scandal involving a relationship with her chamberlain, a man named Eugenius. When this affair was discovered, her brother the emperor had Eugenius executed and essentially placed Honoria under house arrest. She was told she would be married off to a senator named Herculanus, a man she had never chosen and whom she apparently despised. So here was Honoria, a woman who had tasted power and freedom, now facing a future of being married to someone she didn't want and living a life of complete subservience. It was in this moment of desperation that she made the decision that would send shockwaves through the Roman world. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. Honoria wasn't just making an emotional decision, she was making a calculated political gamble. She understood that Attila represented the most serious threat to Roman power, and she believed that by aligning herself with him, she could not only escape her own trapped situation, but also potentially become the most powerful woman in the Western world. Think about it from her perspective. If Attila was going to conquer the Western Empire anyway, which many people believed was inevitable, then why not position herself as his ally rather than his victim? Why not try to turn what seemed like certain disaster into personal opportunity? When Attila received Honoria's message, along with her ring as a token of her sincerity, he must have realized immediately what a gift this was. Here was a legitimate claim to Roman territory, handed to him on a silver platter by a member of the imperial family itself. He could now present any future invasion not as a barbarian conquest, but as a rightful claim to his bride's inheritance. But Attila was far too smart to just accept this offer at face value. He understood that this could be some kind of trap, a way to lure him into a vulnerable position. So he played it carefully, neither rejecting the proposal outright nor immediately marching on Rome. Instead, he used it as another tool in his diplomatic arsenal. The reaction in Ravenna was exactly what you'd expect: complete panic. When word of Honoria's letter reached Emperor Valentinian, he was furious. Not only had his sister committed what amounted to treason, but she had also handed their greatest enemy a potential legal justification for invasion. The imperial court erupted in chaos as officials tried to figure out how to handle this unprecedented crisis. Some advisors suggested that Honoria should be quietly eliminated to prevent her from causing any more trouble. Others argued that they should negotiate with Attila, perhaps offering him something else in exchange for forgetting about the marriage proposal. Still others believed that they should prepare for war, assuming that Attila would use this as an excuse to attack regardless of what they did. But Attila, showing his usual strategic brilliance, didn't immediately press his advantage. Instead, he sent ambassadors to Ravenna with a message that was both reasonable and terrifying. He claimed that he accepted Honoria's proposal and considered himself engaged to her. He demanded that she be sent to him immediately, along with the promised dowry of half the Western Empire. The Romans, of course, refused. They claimed that Honoria had acted without authority, that she had no right to promise any part of the empire to anyone, and that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But Attila had anticipated this response, and he had a ready reply. If the Romans wouldn't honor their princess's word, then they were calling her a liar and insulting both her and him. This put the Romans in an impossible position. They couldn't send Honoria to Attila without essentially handing over half their empire. But they also couldn't completely dismiss her actions without giving Attila a reason to claim that he had been dishonored. It was a masterful piece of diplomatic manipulation that showed just how skilled Attila had become at turning Roman politics against itself. What made this situation even more complex was that Honoria herself remained defiant. Even under house arrest, even facing the possibility of execution for treason, she maintained that her offer to Attila was legitimate. She argued that as an imperial princess, she had the right to choose her own husband, and that if her brother wouldn't respect that right, then she was justified in seeking protection elsewhere. Meanwhile, Attila was using this controversy to his advantage in ways that went far beyond the immediate situation. He was portraying himself throughout the barbarian world as a man who had been accepted by Roman royalty, who had been chosen by an imperial princess over her own family. This enhanced his prestige enormously and made it easier for him to attract allies and supporters. But perhaps most importantly, the whole Honoria affair gave Attila something he had never had before: a legitimate-sounding reason to invade the Western Roman Empire. He could now claim that he wasn't just a barbarian conqueror seeking plunder, but a man defending his rights as a bridegroom and future co-emperor. The stage was now set for what would become one of the most famous military campaigns in history. Attila had his excuse, his armies were ready, and the Western Roman Empire was in chaos. The question was no longer whether he would invade, but when and how devastating that invasion would be. And at the center of it all was Honoria, a woman who had tried to escape the constraints of her time and place by making a deal with the most dangerous man in the world. Whether she was a clever political operator or a desperate woman making a terrible mistake, her actions had set in motion events that would reshape the map of Europe forever. The Bride of Rome had become the key to its potential destruction, and Attila was about to show the world what happened when you gave him both a reason to fight and a claim to legitimacy. By the year 451, it was clear that the Honoria affair had given Attila exactly what he needed: the perfect excuse to invade the Western Roman Empire. But as his massive army began to move westward, something unexpected happened. For the first time since he had become sole ruler of the Huns, Attila found himself facing an opponent who was almost as skilled at strategy and politics as he was. That opponent was Flavius Aetius, a Roman general who had spent his entire career fighting impossible battles and somehow finding ways to win them. Aetius was often called the last of the Romans, and there was good reason for that nickname. While most of the empire's leaders had grown soft and complacent, Aetius had remained sharp, dedicated, and utterly committed to defending what was left of Roman civilization. But here's what made Aetius truly remarkable. He understood that the old ways of doing things weren't going to work anymore. The Western Roman Empire was too weak, too divided, and too broke to face Attila's confederation alone. If Rome was going to survive, it would need to find new allies, even if those allies had been enemies just a few years earlier. So Aetius did something that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of Roman leaders. He reached out to the Visigothic king Theodoric I, whose people had been fighting Romans for decades. The message was simple: Attila represents a threat to all of us, regardless of our past differences. If we don't stand together now, we'll all fall separately. It was a hard sell. The Visigoths had carved out their own kingdom in what is now southern France and northern Spain, and they had no particular love for Rome. But Theodoric was smart enough to realize that if Attila conquered the Western Empire, the Visigoths would probably be next on his list. Better to fight him now with Roman support than face him later when they were completely alone. The result was something that hadn't been seen in generations: a truly united front against a common enemy. Romans and Visigoths, who had been killing each other for years, were now preparing to fight side by side. It was a testament to just how terrifying Attila had become that he could accomplish what centuries of diplomacy had failed to achieve. But Attila wasn't just facing a military challenge. He was also dealing with a crisis of confidence within his own ranks. You see, his confederation was held together primarily by success and fear. As long as he kept winning battles and bringing back plunder, his various tribal allies were happy to follow him. But the moment he showed weakness, the whole structure could collapse. The pressure on Attila was enormous. He had spent years building his reputation as an unstoppable force, and now he was facing his biggest test yet. If he failed to deliver the crushing victory that everyone expected, his empire could fragment overnight. His various allies might decide that they were better off making their own deals with Rome, rather than risking everything on one massive gamble. The two armies finally met near a place called Chalons, in what is now northeastern France. It was June of 451, and the stage was set for what would become one of the most famous battles in European history. The numbers involved were staggering. Some ancient sources claim that as many as 200,000 men fought that day, though modern historians think the actual number was probably closer to 100,000. But even if we take the more conservative estimate, we're still talking about a clash of armies on a scale that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for centuries. This wasn't just a battle between two countries or even two empires. This was a collision between two completely different ways of life: the settled, Christian, Roman world against the nomadic, pagan, barbarian confederation. The battle itself was unlike anything that had been fought before. On one side, you had Attila's Huns, with their legendary archery skills and lightning-fast cavalry charges. Supporting them were Ostrogoths, Gepids, and various other Germanic tribes, each with their own fighting styles and weapons. It was a diverse, multinational army held together by personal loyalty to Attila and the promise of Roman gold. On the other side, you had Aetius's Romans, professional soldiers who had been trained in the classical military traditions that had made Rome great. Fighting alongside them were Theodoric's Visigoths, fierce warriors who had learned to combine their own tribal traditions with Roman military techniques. There were also Alans, Burgundians, and other groups who had decided that their future lay with Rome rather than with Attila. The fighting was absolutely brutal. Ancient sources describe it as one of the bloodiest battles ever fought, with neither side giving any quarter. The Huns, accustomed to quick victories achieved through speed and surprise, found themselves locked in a grinding battle of attrition against enemies who refused to break and run. What made this battle particularly significant was that it represented a clash between two different military philosophies. Attila had always relied on mobility, psychological warfare, and the ability to strike quickly and then disappear before his enemies could organize an effective response. But at Chalons, he found himself facing an enemy who had managed to force him into exactly the kind of prolonged, set-piece battle that favored more traditional armies. The turning point came when King Theodoric was killed in the fighting. His death could have been a disaster for the Roman-Visigothic alliance, but instead, it seemed to inspire his warriors to fight even harder. His son Thorismund took command and led a devastating charge that broke through the Hun lines at a crucial moment. But here's where Attila showed the strategic brilliance that had made him so successful. Realizing that the battle was not going his way, he didn't panic or try to fight to the bitter end. Instead, he began an orderly withdrawal, pulling his forces back to a fortified position where he could regroup and plan his next move. The Romans and their allies had achieved something that many people had thought was impossible. They had stopped Attila the Hun. For the first time in his career, the man who had terrorized Europe had been forced to retreat from a battlefield. The psychological impact was enormous, both for his enemies and for his own followers. But here's the crucial thing to understand. Attila had been stopped, but he hadn't been defeated. His army was still intact, his confederation was still together, and he was still the most dangerous man in Europe. The Battle of Chalons had proven that he could be resisted. but it hadn't proven that he could be destroyed. In fact, some historians argue that the real victory at Chalons belonged not to the Romans or the Visigoths, but to Attila himself. By managing to withdraw his forces in good order and avoid a complete disaster, he had preserved his army and his reputation. He had shown that even when faced with the most powerful coalition that could be assembled against him, he was still capable of surviving and fighting another day. The battle also revealed something important about the nature of Attila's power. His strength didn't come just from military might, but from his ability to adapt to changing circumstances and to turn apparent defeats into strategic advantages. The fact that he had been stopped at Chalons didn't diminish his legend. In some ways, it enhanced it, because it showed that he was human enough to face setbacks, but strong enough to overcome them. As the dust settled on the battlefield at Chalons, one thing was clear. This was not the end of Attila's story. The Battle of Chalons had shaken Christendom, but it had also shown that the conflict between the Hun confederation and the Roman world was far from over. Attila had been stopped, but he had not been defeated, and that distinction would prove to be crucial in the months and years that followed. The last great general of Rome had won a victory, but it was a victory that left both sides exhausted and uncertain about what would come next. The question now was whether Aetius could build on his success at Chalons, or whether Attila would find a way to turn his tactical defeat into a strategic advantage. The fate of Europe still hung in the balance, and the Scourge of God was far from finished with his work. It's spring of 453, and Attila the Hun is at the height of his power. The man who had brought Rome to its knees, who had emperors sending him cartloads of gold just to stay away, was about to celebrate what should have been his greatest triumph. But sometimes, fate has other plans. After decades of conquest and political maneuvering, Attila decided it was time for another wedding. This wasn't unusual for him. Powerful rulers often took multiple wives to seal alliances and demonstrate their strength. But this particular bride was special. She was Ildiko, a young Gothic princess whose beauty was said to rival that of Helen of Troy herself. The wedding feast was legendary, even by Hun standards. Imagine thousands of warriors gathered around massive bonfires, the air thick with smoke and the sound of celebration. Attila, now in his early 50s, drank deeply from golden cups, likely gifts from his many conquered enemies. He laughed, he boasted of future conquests, and he spoke of the sons this new marriage might bring him. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. The morning after his wedding night, servants found Attila dead in his bridal chamber. The great conqueror lay still, blood around his mouth and nose, while his new bride sat trembling beside him, covered in blood but apparently unharmed. What had happened? The court erupted in whispers and accusations. Some pointed fingers at Ildiko. Had this Gothic princess been sent as an assassin? Was this revenge for all the devastation Attila had brought to her people? The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidence. Others whispered about a nosebleed gone wrong. Attila had been drinking heavily, and some said he might have choked on his own blood during the night. It sounds almost too simple for such a feared warrior, but alcohol and blood don't mix well, especially for a man who had lived a life of constant stress and violence. But perhaps the most chilling theory came from his own people. Many Huns believed their king had been struck down by the gods themselves. After all, Attila had called himself the Scourge of God, claiming divine mandate for his conquests. Had he finally gone too far? Had heaven itself decided to end his reign? The truth is, we'll never know for certain what killed Attila. What we do know is that his death sent shockwaves through the ancient world. This was a man who had seemed invincible, who had made the mightiest empire on earth pay tribute like a conquered province. And now he was gone, undone not by Roman legions or Byzantine strategy, but by whatever had happened in that darkened chamber. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Attila's empire, held together by his personality and reputation, began to crumble almost immediately. His sons fought viciously among themselves for control, dividing the Hun confederation into warring factions. The Germanic tribes that had served under Attila saw their chance and rebelled, eager to throw off the Hun yoke. Within months, the vast empire that had stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea was in ruins. The Huns, who had terrorized Europe for decades, found themselves scattered and powerless. It's remarkable how quickly it all fell apart, like a house of cards that had been held up by the sheer force of one man's will. Rome, meanwhile, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The emperors in both the east and west had lived in constant fear of Attila's return. Now, suddenly, that threat was gone. The gold that had flowed northward to Hun territories could stay in Roman coffers. The nightmare was over. But Attila's death also marked the end of an era. With the Hun threat removed, the various barbarian tribes that had been united under his banner began to carve up Europe among themselves. In a way, his death accelerated the very thing he had been fighting against, the final collapse of Roman power in the West. The irony is striking. Attila had spent his life trying to destroy Rome, but his sudden death actually helped finish the job. Without the Hun threat to unite them, the Western Romans found themselves facing multiple enemies on all fronts. Within 20 years, the last Western emperor would be deposed, and the Roman Empire in the West would be nothing more than a memory. As for Ildiko, history loses track of her after that terrible night. Some say she returned to her Gothic people, carrying the secret of what really happened in that chamber. Others believe she was quietly executed by Hun nobles who suspected her involvement. Like so much about Attila's death, her fate remains a mystery. What's certain is that the world changed forever on that spring night in 453. The Scourge of God was dead, his empire was crumbling, and Europe would never be the same. Sometimes the most powerful men fall not to armies or assassins, but to the simple, inexorable forces of mortality itself. In the end, Attila the Hun, who had conquered nations and humbled empires, was defeated by something as basic as a wedding night gone wrong. It's a reminder that no matter how mighty we become, we're all still human, still vulnerable to the unexpected twists of fate that can change everything in a single moment. So here we are, more than 1,500 years after Attila's death, and we're still talking about him. Think about that for a moment. Empires have risen and fallen, technologies have transformed our world beyond recognition, yet the name of this Hun king still carries weight. Why? The answer lies in what Attila represented and what he accomplished in his brief but explosive reign. His empire lasted only about 20 years under his personal rule, barely a blip in the grand timeline of history. Yet in that short span, he managed to do something that seemed impossible. He made Rome afraid. Picture the senators in their marble halls, the emperors in their golden palaces, suddenly realizing that their mighty legions couldn't protect them from a nomadic horseman from the steppes. For centuries, Romans had believed themselves the masters of the civilized world. Then came Attila, and suddenly they were writing him checks like nervous shopkeepers paying protection money to the neighborhood tough. But here's what makes Attila's story so fascinating. He wasn't just a mindless destroyer. Sure, he could burn cities and scatter armies, but his real genius lay in understanding something that many conquerors missed. Sometimes the threat of violence is more powerful than violence itself. Why waste soldiers taking a city when you can simply demand tribute and get the same result? This psychological warfare was revolutionary. Attila turned fear into a currency more valuable than gold. Roman emperors would literally count the days until their next payment was due, terrified of what might happen if they were late. Imagine being so intimidating that you could make the world's greatest empire pay you just to stay away. That's not just military skill, that's pure psychological mastery. The ripple effects of his reign continue to shape our world today. When Attila died and his empire collapsed, it created a power vacuum that accelerated the fall of Western Rome. The various tribes that had served under him scattered across Europe, eventually forming the foundations of medieval kingdoms. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa. In a strange way, Attila's death helped create the map of medieval Europe. But perhaps most importantly, Attila proved that no empire, no matter how mighty, is truly invincible. Rome had seemed eternal, unchanging, destined to rule forever. Then, this Hun king appeared and showed that even the mightiest civilizations have cracks that can be exploited. It's a lesson that echoes through history, from Alexander facing the Persian Empire to David confronting Goliath. So was he a monster? Well, he certainly wasn't gentle. By modern standards, Attila was undoubtedly a war criminal. He destroyed cities, enslaved populations, and showed little mercy to those who opposed him. But in his time, such behavior wasn't unusual among rulers. What made him different was his effectiveness at it. Was he a genius? Absolutely. His ability to unite diverse tribes under his banner, to outmaneuver Roman diplomats, and to build an empire from nothing but horse and blade that takes extraordinary intelligence. He understood logistics, psychology, and politics better than most of his contemporaries. The fact that his empire collapsed so quickly after his death only proves how much it depended on his personal skills. Or was he simply a man who saw weakness and seized destiny? Maybe this comes closest to the truth. Attila lived in a time when the old order was crumbling, when Rome's strength was more appearance than reality. He had the vision to see these cracks and the courage to exploit them. In another age, he might have been a merchant or a diplomat. But in the 5th century, opportunity wore armor and rode a horse. The stories about Attila have grown over the centuries, becoming the stuff of legend. In Germanic tales, he became Etzel, a figure both feared and respected. In Hungarian mythology, he's remembered as a great king who defended his people. Even in places he never conquered, his name became synonymous with unstoppable force. What's remarkable is how his reputation has endured across cultures that normally would have nothing good to say about a foreign conqueror. There's something about his story that transcends the usual winner writes history narrative. Maybe it's because he represented something universal. The outsider who challenges the establishment, the underdog who takes on the giant and wins. Today, when we face our own seemingly invincible institutions and systems, Attila's story still resonates. He reminds us that nothing is permanent, that even the mightiest powers can be brought low by someone willing to think differently and act boldly. He shows us that sometimes the barbarian at the gates sees more clearly than the emperor in his palace. The truth is, we need figures like Attila in our historical memory. Not because we should admire his methods, but because he represents the eternal human struggle between order and chaos, between the established and the revolutionary. He embodies the dangerous but necessary truth that change, even violent change, is sometimes inevitable. In the end, Attila the Hun was neither pure monster nor pure genius, but something more complex, a man who understood his moment in history and seized it with both hands. His empire may have crumbled, but his legacy lives on in every story about the underdog who challenged the mighty, in every reminder that no power lasts forever, and in every question about what it really means to be civilized. The scourge is gone, as the saying goes, but history never forgets. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. If this story moved you, like the video, comment your thoughts, and share it with those who love medieval history. Subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more legendary tales. The scourge is gone, but history never forgets.